Today we're inviting you to dive into the infinitely small, into a part of the world that's extremely close to us and yet incredibly vast.
Take an average human being like me, about 1.80 meters tall. Let's shrink him down to 1 meter and then even further.
Here we are at the scale of a bee, 100 times smaller. Already a novel world, yet not entirely unfamiliar. And in terms of size, still close to us. Let's shrink ourselves by another 90%.
We've only just started exploring this topic. At this scale, a single grain of pepper towers over you like a small building.
Despite being only 1 millimeter, we are 4 times larger than a fingernail's thickness and thrice the size of a mite.
A creature that you would have to line up about 50 times to match the length of our bee. By shrinking our size tenfold,
we end up being just about 5 times smaller than a grain of salt and 3 times smaller than a snowflake. Still at this scale, the tip of a ballpoint pen looks like a monstrous drill. At 1/10 of a millimeter long, it would take 6 of me lined up to equal the size of this pen tip. And now, I'm 3 times smaller than the mite we saw earlier, about the same size as a human egg cell. And almost as big as the thickness of a hair, which you can see here, sliced into sections.
we are now 18,000 times smaller than when we started. All things considered, at this scale, facing a glass that's a few centimeters tall at this scale is like, at normal scale, standing in front of a vertical wall that's about 500 meters high. And we have more or less the size of a trichome, a kind of thin outgrowth or appendage that you can find here on the surface of a walnut leaf. But to really get to the heart of the subject, we're going to have to keep diving deeper. Let's shrink ourselves by another factor of 10.
And now our trichomes have become as imposing as baobab trees. All things considered, the walnut leaf on which this microscopic forest stands is now, for me, as vast as Paris. Within its walls, for a human at this scale, at the same time, it's just a leaf and a whole world of its own. At this scale, we reach the limit of human vision without aid. My scale is now that of pollen grains. These, with their incredibly varied shapes and sizes, are all more or less my size. And pollen grains like these, you can find thousands of them on the legs of a bee. At 10 micrometers, only 1/5 of a hair's cross-section fits in the image. The world's first commercial microprocessor is the same size as red blood cells, which are 30 times smaller than a snowflake. At this scale, we could perch on the antenna of an ant, which might make us feel like we're almost nothing, except that almost nothing is already something prodigiously immense compared to what's waiting for us. Let's reduce ourselves by another 90%.
To reach the micrometer at the level of bacteria. Each sausage-shaped object on this protrusion, magnified by the microscope, is a 1 to 2 micrometer long bacterium. Not all bacteria are this size. These creatures vary greatly in size, ranging from 10 times larger to 10 times smaller than me. But most are found in these waters. At this scale, everything around us is extraordinarily huge. I am 6 times smaller than a compact cassette tape's thickness. With my size of 1 micrometer, standing in front of a 5 centimeter glass, by comparison, if I were to scale, would be like facing a wall about 50 kilometers high. Despite such measurements, we are still giants compared to viruses, which is fascinating.
Which are 10 to 100 times smaller. And even the smallest of these viruses is still nearly 10 times larger
than the width of a DNA helix. Let's shrink ourselves by another factor of 10.
We get to something like the size of a water molecule, and it would take 500,000 molecules like this one lined up to match the thickness of our hair. In fact, we are actually one step closer in terms of size to an object like the sun than to a water molecule, and that's by a factor of 10.
Let's shrink ourselves by 3 more times. Small, so small. Now we're at the size of an atom in our water molecule. From here on, even with artists' renderings, it's hard to represent all this with images. In the infinitely small, if we try too hard to be visual, we often risk being disappointed. The simplifications are there to keep our brains from melting. And to avoid saying things that are way off, we need to start making the images a bit blurry. Because the size differences between this atom and the elements that make it up are about the same as those between a bee and a skyscraper. To go from an atom's average diameter to that of a proton or neutron, you must shrink by a factor. 10,000.
In other words, the atom's nucleus is 10,000 times smaller than the atom itself. There is a vast amount of space between the elements and their revolving electrons. And have we reached a limit there? Well, no. And maybe that's the most dizzying thing about this story. Because as small as we are now, we're still very far from the goal. Since our original size, we've only covered a third of the way toward the smallest thing we suspect exists in the universe. In fact, reduced as I am to the size of a nucleon, the distance that separates me from the smallest unit we can suspect, a unit called the Planck length, and it's the same as the distance between the size of a human being and our galaxy. Or a grain of pollen from a distance of 1 light year. Between us and this unit, there's a delightful bestiary of subatomic particles, some of which have been discovered and others that are still hypothetical. Beyond that limit, we don't know. Physics loses its footing. There's a break in scale, the equations shatter. But maybe other things are hiding beyond.
Finally, let's pause briefly on this odd concept. The Planck length is so small that, proportionally speaking, we are actually closer to the largest thing we can see, the observable universe, than to the smallest thing whose existence is supposed. And that's still huge. A modest magnification of 77. The adventure starts with a small pile of pollen that we had the chance to examine under an electron microscope at the École des Mines de Saint-Étienne. During this creative residency, let's dive into the infinite detail of the secrets of matter, which already reveal strange mounds, unknown landscapes.
Which, secretive, gradually reveal themselves. Chaotic reliefs appear like cracked shells and grainy surfaces that cover each of these grains barely more than 15 microns. And it is in the blur of a 660,000 times magnification that our journey ends.